welcome everybody to this session, and we were very close to the panel here. With illustrious right now, um, no about yeah, and Bacha isn't here. The anti-class school, so we can talk about class over. So I'm going to begin with Yascha Mounk, who I've known for quite a while actually, before he rose to superstardom. Yasha is a professor of practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, the founder of Persuasion, which I urge you to check out. It's I guess what we call it a newspaper in law. And also the host of a podcast, which I'm addicted to, The Good Fight. His latest book is entitled The Identity Trap, The Story of Ideas and Power in Our Time. And he writes a weekly column for his over 100,000 subscribers at www.yashamonk.substack.com. And we also have, of course, Stevie Hinker, who is the Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University and the author of 13 books, including Enlightenment Now and a forthcoming When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, Common Knowledge and the Science of Harmony, Hypocrisy, and Outrage. With that, I'm going to turn things over to you. Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here among some old friends, many people who I've admired from afar and who we get to know better over the next days, and was a pleasure to hear with Dave to see. It's in my contract, but I never have to speak after Steve. That's why I'm speaking first. There's a old joke that whether there's two Jews, there's free opinion. I guess whether there's 100 heterodox scholars, there must be 150 opinions and 200 definitions of wokeness. And that's already come up in the last panel. I nevertheless do want to talk a little bit about how to define the set of ideas which constitute the orthodoxy against which the heterodoxy which communists we share is, I think, set up. Because I think understanding their set of ideas is important for us to understand what rightly understood the heterodox enterprise is or should be. And I think it also implies that the best way to be heterodox is to do so on the basis of a substantive set of values, which I would define it to. There's many different elements to the cultural phenomenon we've gone through over the last decade or so. And I think it's important to distinguish between elements that are certainly a big part of this phenomenon, that don't go to the core of its definition, and elements that actually define the set of ideas, or the body of ideas that has become so well established so quickly in so many institutions in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in other countries. And I think some of the cancellation movements going up, I want that certainly are a very important element of this time period, but that they share with many other time periods. Whether you're thinking of Salem, Massachusetts in 1890, or of Beijing, China in 1960, you see similar attempts to try and cancel those whose views place them outside of some orthodox union. So I don't think that, for example, can go to the heart of defining good but wokeness, or what I call, that's. I do think that we have to take seriously the fact that we're dealing with a set of particular ideas. And in my book, The Identity Trap, I get to these ideas first historically, having the history of ideas that has led to the 6 major fields which have been constituted as body of work. And then I offer a kind of rational deconstruction of these ideas, saying that they can be reduced in a different kind of intellectual mode to a few research you 3D animate those ideas. And that, I think, is the best way of understanding what we're eating. The first of these ideas is that, first of these propositions, is that the right way to understand the right way to understand what's going on in the world is to look at it through the vision of group identity, and in particular to the prism of race, sex, gender, and sexual orientation. In the same way in which Marxists thought that class was the key motor of history, was the key variable that explains everything from a historical event like the revolution to the right interpretation of a particular work of literature like the novel, to the way in which we interact as we break our coffee and our tea. I still don't understand why the English have said our tea, haven't really said. So I think people who believe the identity synthesis think that it is these markers of group identity like race, gender, and sexual orientation that really are at the very core of history, of culture, of social interactions, that they hold the real key to understanding what happens in the world. The second claim is, and again there's a kind of parallel to Marxism here, is that any set of universal values, any attempt at establishing neutral standards for society are just a way to cloak the injustices and the discrimination and the violence that have historically defined our society. And so when somebody talks about the values of the American punk or the values of classical liberalism, what they're really doing is to try and pull the wool over our eyes, to blind us to what is really going on in society, which already applies when they woke, right? To be woke is to be unblinded from the lies of the universal values and descriptions that are meant to distract us from the truth. And this entails submission that we haven't been able to make any progress on any of those forms of discrimination. But even though it might seem that our society developed us on the orbit when it was 25, 50 years ago, in truth, it is justice that. Even though it may seem that we've made some significant progress towards treating people of different ethnicities, cultural origins as equals in our society, in truth, there are these hidden forms of structural racism which may not be quite as blatant as 50 or 200 years ago, but in fact turn out to be justice. And then the third claim that follows rather logically to grant the first two is that in order to make progress, we need to reject any attempt at living up to universal values and mutual standards. But since these are just an attempt to pull the wool over our eyes, the only true way to make progress is to abandon and to embrace a society, a polity, in which how we treat each other always explicitly depends on the kind of group of which we are. So rather than institutions saying that they're going to treat or applicant to a university equally, rather than state saying that it's going to distribute vaccines equally to citizens, rather than saying that the right way to treat upon a citizenization is to treat them and speak to them the same, with the same respect, but also the same brightness, whether they're a man or a woman, or they're white or from an ethnic minority, etc. The answer here is to say that no, actually we have to discriminate in order to fight against discrimination. Though we have to make special allowances, create special quotas for certain groups, that we cannot, as is the case in the United States, distribute as past COVID vaccines first to the elderly who are most at risk because they are predominantly white, and so it would be racist to do so. And so even for the 60s or Morris Road, that deviating from that plan would increase the number of deaths. We in fact have to distribute vaccines to a much broader category of essential workers who are more rapidly representative. And even in conversation, you always have to be on the guard against any form of microaggression that might potentially undermine somebody. So that, to me, is the core and the way to understand what wokeness is. To look at these three claims. But number one, race, gender, and sexual orientation is the key way to understand society. Number two, any attempt to implement universal values is just an attempt to strike from injustice. And number three, therefore, we have to abandon those universal values. So I think that a number of interesting things follow from that kind of definition of what wokeness is. One of them, I'll say as a side note, has come up a few times today, and is very much in the debate today, that it helps us assess the usefulness of a term like a woke right. Right? So a woke right is an idea by James Lindsay, who has pointed out, I think rightly, some genuine paradox between the unhealthy dynamics in many left-wing political spaces, especially online over the last 10 years, and some of the unhealthy dynamics that now they're quickly going up in some right-wing online spaces in the United States and elsewhere. And I think what that gets right is to point at the way in which both of those political movements are in danger of falling into this cancellation behavior. But as I've already pointed out in the beginning on the talk, I think that those forms of cancellation behaviors are a subset of many different political movements. Those cancellations of witches in New England, of people who were not sufficient radical in cultural revolution, of people who were heterodox in our sense in the last years at American universities, and now of people who don't actually support Donald Trump or perhaps push back against certain forms of online racism on the American online right. That is not something that allows us to understand a distinctive political move. The same is true for some of the ideological content. There's genuine disanalogy here between how the woke right thinks about this and how the woke left. Both of those movements, I think, are an attempt to sanctify a psychological instinct. There's a very old psychological instinct in human beings, probably shaped by our evolutionary history, that we are always ready to split groups into the in-group and the out, often capable of showing great altruism, courage, and independently in-group, and we're also capable, unfortunately, of great cruelty and meanness towards the outcast. And there have always been ideological movements, or in something else. Well, one of the key points of civilization, one of the key points of a successful culture, is to mitigate against that instinct, to harness it for good in certain forms of collective solidarity, but also to mitigate against the work most. To teach us, for example, that in a country like the United Kingdom, there may be 5 nations, there may be people of different philosophical convictions, religious beliefs, different skin colors, and nevertheless, we can have something in common as Britons. This is one of the things that is supposed to guide us towards being able to cooperate as an enlarged in-group, as opposed to excluding people as out-group members who don't fully belong to be discriminated against. The right has historically, or parts of the right have historically, used certain forms of non-inclusive nationalism, inclusive nationalism, certain forms of non-exclusive nationalism, in order to sanctify the psychological instinct of exclusion, of saying, well, we don't, in fact, have to care about the well-being of this person over there and that person over there. I think what's interesting about the woke left is that it is a Lessig form of sanctifying that same evolutionary instinct, of saying that actually, truly your virtue, your goodness comes from your mental and a subnational identity. And all you owe is moral duties to other members of that identity groups. To everything else, you don't care. You're displaying your interest against this other group. And there's nothing wrong with indulging that blind preference for your in-group over everybody. So again, I think there's a similarity here between some of the forms of white nationalism that are coming up on the woke right as a form of repeating that civilization, and some of those forms of the woke left. But that doesn't mean that they're the same ideology. And so I think that the term woke right is used as a kind of shorthand to describe some of the dangers that these ideologies share. They ultimately come from very different ideological histories, very different ideological. And therefore, I think this term, while I use for shorthand, ultimately calls short, because it sells short the fundamental ideological differences in the tradition that the woke right draws on, and the tradition that the woke left draws on, and therefore makes look more similar than they. So there's another thing that I think follows from the definition of wokeness that I've given, or the identity synthesis that I've given. And that is that if at bottom this is a set of ideas that is able to win adherence, in part because it has a coherent narrative to tell about what the world looks like, then we need, in order to fight against it, to have a coherent response to those ideas, one that is actually founded in a rich intellectual tradition. And I believe that the most obvious response to that comes from the philosophically liberal tradition. Because going back to those big claims, I think that liberalism has a very obvious depart to give to each of these ideas. These three ideas are, first of all, but yes, of course, race, gender, and sexual orientation matter in understanding how society works. There are forms of discrimination. There are ways in which each of these three categories have historically shaped our societies. And in order to understand the politics, economics, sociology of our society, we have to take those seriously. But they are by no means the only prisms through which to look at society. Other prisms, well represented by various scholars here today, matter as well. It also matters how to think about the society in economic, social class as a category that is poor. What people believe in, what they aspire to matters. So religion matters and patriotism matter. And of course, individual differences of character and motivation and behavior matter greatly as well. So rather than going monomaniacally at each situation and reading it through the prism about reason and ideology, the liberal will look at each situation and say, which of the different kind of contexts we have for understanding society, which of the different kind of prisms we have for understanding reality, best explains what is going on in this particular situation. The second point is to acknowledge that, yes, of course, there have historically been genuine injustice. And of course, historically, we have not fully lived up to the aspirations that we've had as a society. But we have, in fact, been able to make tremendous progress towards equality. And we've been able to make that progress precisely by living up to liberal values and precisely by people who consider themselves philosophically liberal. From Frederick Douglass, who in his speech on the 4th of July argued that those who referred to the Declaration of Independence and its promise to make all men equal, or that all men were created equal, were hypocrites, because in his time first took slavery in the United States, but who then insisted that the right way to respond to that is to live up to that ideal, not to dismiss it. To Martin Luther King, who said that the check issued by the Bank of Justice has turned out to be fraudulent, but who didn't tell his followers to rip up that check, but rather called on the Bank of Justice to honor it. To the gay rights movement, which had a big internal debate about whether it should fight for ideas like same-sex marriage, in which some of the more radical members of the movement said, we don't want to be breeders, we don't want to get married, we don't want any of those bourgeois things. But those people said, no, it is that equality that we want. And by fighting for that equality, that we gain societal respect and win over the great majority of the population. It was people who fought on behalf of philosophically liberal values, but have in fact been able to move our society to much greater equality. And therefore, thus this the first two premises implied, if you grant them, the third point, the conclusion in the identity synthesis, to the liberal, these 2 points imply a very clear conclusion. If identity is at one prism through which to look at society, and if we have in fact been able to make tremendous progress in society by living up to liberal values, by invoking both, then the remaining injustices, which are real, are best combated by continuing to argue for these ideals and arguing for these stands. Liberalism has always been an aspirational tree. It's always been a tree that looked at society and said, here are some injustices, we have a set of ideas about how to make things better, and that is the sense in which we should remain within liberalism. So acknowledging that there are imperfections in our society, but proudly saying that it is this ideology that is best able to fight for. I think this also implies a set of things about strategy and perhaps tactics. One of the things that has most annoyed me in my social milieu, being at an American university, a Western social milieu, is the sometimes knee-jerk way in which some of my supposedly most sophisticated intellectual friends delegate what they believe out to their political enemies. It's called the Fox News fallacy. If Fox News says something, it must be wrong. And I'm going to take whatever position Fox News hasn't taken. That, I think, is a profound intellectual error, and it's a profound tactical error. But I hope that us, quote-unquote, heterodox social scientists don't start falling into the MSNBC fallacy. Don't start saying, we are defined not by a substantive set of ideals and values, but rather we are defined simply by what we oppose. And we're going to let us be guided by being against whatever majority of our faculty colleagues believe. That is, I think, neither intellectually fruitful, nor is it strategically smart. And I do think that that's particularly important at a time in which the attacks on the values that we share, like freedom of speech, come not just from the left, but also from the administration of Donald Trump in the United States. I think that the Trump administration, particularly in the way it is dealing with universities, had a fundamental choice about whether to use the power of federal government in limited but real ways to fight against forms of ideological coercion on campus, or whether to try and impose its own set of ideas and values on those universities. So one of the things that I think would have been legitimate, for example, is that many public universities in the United States that still require faculty applicants to file diversity statements. And these diversity statements don't just ask you to explain how you are able to work with a variety of students in different walks of life. It's perfectly fine. But rather we know from various grading rubrics of those statements that they require applicants to pay lip service to the values of critical race theory, particular set of pedagogical practices, which I happen to believe violate basic liberal principles. Violate in particular, I think, the best pedagogical practice, which is to treat each student with respect for the culture and the interests, but most of all as would-be contributors to an intellectual community whose ideas are going to be evaluated on the strengths and the weaknesses in equal fashion. I think it would be appropriate for the university to say, for the administration to say, that universities that require such statements reduce some federal funding. That is a way to use federal power to counter forms of ideological coercion that exist today. But instead, a lot of what the administration has done in the last week and the last months go well beyond that. They have really decided that we're not able to change the culture of the American universities, and therefore they're going to weaken them in any way possible. And that's not only going to weaken what remain, despite the many problems they have, important centers of learning in the world, that also is undermining freedom of speech and academic freedom in significant ways. When, for example, the visas of students are cancelled because they write op-eds in the student newspaper. Op-eds that I may not personally agree with, but that are clearly part of the exercise of academic freedom. Or because, for example, a university like Harvard is asked to hand over 5 years' worth of video of all protest activity in which any non-citizen may have been present, something that clearly has a chilling effect on the free speech rights, both of students from our country and of American citizens who may have participated in those protests. And most importantly, I think this is a mistake, because what we should aim for is a society in which we all enjoy genuine free speech and genuine academic freedom at every institution, not a society in which what each university looks like depends on a political battle about who happens to predominate in which board of regents, which governor happens to be of which political party, or which president happens to be in the White House at one time or another. I don't want to live in a society where those who believe in the identity synthesis have free speech for 4 years, and then the heterodox have free speech for 4 years, and the ones have free speech in Florida and the others have a free speech in Massachusetts. I want to live in a society where all of us have free speech and academic freedom at all times. And I don't think that fighting the identity synthesis by illiberal means can possibly get us to that range.
Thank you very much. What are we against? I think there's a lot of clarity and consensus about that in this room and these arguments. Many of us are against politically correct universities, cancel culture, social justice warfare, critical theory, postmodernism, wokeness. Our question is, what are we for? I have seen too many people who are against this wisdom wrongs spraying it recoil over to what they think of as the opposite, which does not result in a coherent view of what we are for. So do we want a university of political incorrectness? Aquaview of the council? Are we in favor of social injustice? Uncritical theory? Postmodernism? Or as Yascha alluded to, woke rightism? There was a saying from the joke from the old Soviet Union. What is the definition of capitalism? The exploitation of men by mass. What is the definition of communism? Exact opposite. I think there is a danger that if we simply define ourselves as unwoke to lurch from woke leftism to woke rightism. In particular, when it comes to the authoritarian populism of Donald Trump and yes, Vladimir Putin, embraced by some critics of wokeism, such as Gordon Peterson, it ends up not being a rebound after all, but the proverbial portion. In many ways, Trump is a disciple of Michel Foucault, that there is no objective truth, equal power, that group identity trumps individual rights, that free speech would be submerged to new interests, and that life consists of a struggle to see between oppressors and the oppressed, in this case, elites versus ordinary Americans. Is there a coherent and defensible alternative? And the question was raised earlier whether liberty, a defensive liberty and freedom, leads open the question of how should this freedom and liberty be expressed, exercised? And that's what I try to do in my book, Enlightenment Now, and that's what I'll try to summarize in the rest of this talk. Namely, I think there is a coherent set of beliefs and values that we can call the ideals of the Enlightenment, related to classical liberalism, or as I jogged about, what's in liberal science. That is, in a nutshell, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Key Enlightenment ideas, I suggest, are reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about it. It all begin in reason. Reason is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than currency, as soon as you try to argue why you're right, why other people should believe you, that we're not lying or full of crap, you lost the argument because you haven't appealed to reason. Now, as a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to insist that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. We generalize from anecdotes, we being stereotypes, we seek evidence that confirms our beliefs and ignore evidence that disconfirms them, and we're overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our attitude. But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms. Free speech, so that one person's fallacies can be pointed out by another person. Open criticism and debate for the same reason. Logical analysis. fact-checking, and empirical testing, which brings me to the second enlightening value, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible, that you can understand the world by formulating possible explanations and testing its reality. Science, we have reason to believe, is our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment idea is there can be a science of human nature, that beliefs about society are testable just like any other beliefs. Science, moreover, provides not just technical knowledge, but fundamental insights about human condition, such as naturalism. The universe has no goal or purpose related to human welfare, with the important implication that if we want to improve that welfare, we have to figure out how to do it ourselves. Entropy. In a closed system without input of energy, disorder increases. Things fall apart, stuff happens. Because there are vastly more ways for things to go wrong than the things to go right. And evolution. Humans are products of a competitive process which selects for reproductive success, not well-being. As the coiner of the term enlightenment, Manuel Kant, pointed out, a cookie tipper of humanity, no truly straight thing to be built. The third ideal is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings. Because you might think, well, isn't that obvious? Isn't it that banal? Well, what else could be a hulk moral purpose be? Well, in fact, there are many alternatives to humanism. Had a great deal of a treat of dope, such as that the ultimate purpose is to enhance the glory, tribe, nation, race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of the divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some dialectic struggle or pursue the utopian or messianic age. Now, humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. Now, by default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We innately feel the pain only of our blood relatives, our close friends, our allies, and chiefly furry baby animals. But the circle of sympathy can be expanded through the courses of cosmopolitanism, education, journalism, art, mobility, and reason. Yes, reason can make us more habit or sympathetic because it forces us to the realization that there's nothing special about me. I can't consist, as soon as I engage in any kind of dialogue, my interests are special and yours aren't, because I'm me and you're not. Any more than I can insist that that spot I'm standing on is a special, unique place in the universe I have to be standing on. As Abraham Lincoln put it, A can prove, however conclusively, that he may right enslave B. Why may not B snaps the same argument can B believe that he may slave? Also, we find ourselves in countless positive sum games. Because we are so vulnerable, there's so many ways in which we can suffer, and many ways in which we can enhance others' well-being at small cost to ourselves. And so if each of us helps the other and refrains from hurting the other, then everyone wins. It's in everyone's interests to adopt universal humanist values. Finally, we get the ideal of progress that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. Now, you might wonder if human nature doesn't change, a proposition that I had conspicuously advanced in my book, like Slate, how could progress even be possible? And the answer from the Enlightenment is through benign institutions. Groups of people who agree to follow certain norms that allow us to deploy energy and knowledge to combat entropy, that magnify the better angels of our nature, to quote Weekend again, such as, in particular, reason, sympathy, and marginalize our inner demons, our biases, our illusions, our tribalism, our thirst for dominance and madness. What do I mean by Enlightenment institutions? Well, most obviously there was democracy. There's declarations of rights that draw lines on what majorities can insist on. Markets, organizations of global cooperation, and institutions of truth-seeking, such as academies, scientific societies and the free press. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? Well, I think in this case, we can go to the data. And many ways the Enlightenment project proving the being well-being by the application of knowledge to inclusivity has worked. So the most obvious thing is life itself, as was noted in a previous spell. For most of human existence, life expectancy of birth hovered around 30 years. But thanks to advances such as vaccinations and antibiotics, life expectancy worldwide is now over 70, more than 80 in the developed world. So as Steve also put it, science has not just given us extra life, she's given us an extra life. It's as if we have invented 2 lives or more. We are better fed, although there was a widespread intuition starting with Thomas Malthus and continuing to much green movement today that population growth would inevitably lead to massive famines. In fact, the exact opposite. Do I have a laser pointer there? Does it work? Does it work? Yes, it does. This is population, which has increased fivefold. These are famine deaths, which during the same period of time have and down.
What happened in the 18th?
Yeah, in the 1870s, there were famines in parts of the world that in Asia, I believe, in South Asia, it killed massive. It was, I believe, South Asia, in East Asia. Oh, I think we are more after several millennia, which economic growth was less than 1 pixel high in graph after the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, close to a product increase for under tool. This did not go to the proverbial 1%. In fact, it decimated extreme poverty. By today's standards, 200 years ago, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. Today, that is less than 9%. It continues at all day. We are safer. In the Middle Ages, homicide rates in Europe were about, on average, 35 for 100,000 per year, and as plummeted to 1 for 100,000 per year. This is a logarithmic scale. On the 100 down to 10 homicide per year. We are more peaceful, and this is a development that only really kicked in at the Second World War. In the years after the Second World War, the rate of deaths in battles are about 20 for 100,000 per year. Even with the recent uptick because of Ukraine, South Sudan, Gaza, Ethiopia, it's about 1.5 per 100,000. We are more literate. 200 years ago, 15% of the world was literate. Today, more than 90% of the world was literate. 200 years ago, less than a fifth of humanity had even an elementary school education. Today is maybe 80%. And contrary to a widespread but untested belief that all of this progress has left us in a state of alienation and only suicide and dejectedness and neediness. In about all countries for which we had data on human happiness in 2 points in time, more than 80% of them, the latest data point is show greater happiness than in earlier points. And again, contrary to a widespread belief that rates of suicide would soar, which is true of some limited demographics, worldwide the suicide rate over the last 40 years has actually plummeted more than 40%. So does this mean we should believe in progress? And the answer is no. As the viewers, Bradley Wood said, I don't believe in anything, you have to believe it. Progress is an effect of certain causes. It is not magic. There is no force of nature that mystically ever upward. Quite the contrary, because of entropy and evolution, the natural is constantly trying to grind us down, but only human ingenuity shall be human institutions that allow us to fight back and claw back the of progress. which means that we should protect and improve the institutions to make progress possible. Among them, science, democracy, free press, universities, and academies and organizations. Finally, thus, to elect the values dream light, meaning, and purpose. This is a complaint that I sometimes hear. Is humanism average? Flat? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? People need to believe in Europe's Father in the sky, strong keep at the fight. It's a heroic ancestors. Well, I don't think so. It's one thing, secular liberal democracy, happiest, healthiest places on earth, and they are the prime destination of people who vote with their feet. Also, I would say that applying knowledge and sympathy to attends he was flourishing is heroic, glorious, as I say, spiritual. It's not just a myth, but true to the best of our knowledge. It was the only true religion now. And it applies not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity. I'll end with a statement from a historian who is often noted for his pessimism, Arnold Toynbee, can't obey find and fall of numerous civilizations. But he pointed out a couple of decades ago, the 20th century will be chiefly remembered in future centuries not as an age of political conflict with decadent inventions, but as an age in which human society dared to think of the welfare of the whole human race as a path or rejected. I would like to think that that would be true of the 21st century as well. Is it a positive vision to strive for, as well as all of the negatives that it decides to this cause? Thank you. Great. Okay, we got about 15 minutes. I'm told we have a hard stop at 6 days, so please keep your questions really short. Okay, we are so as a cognitive psychologist, and I actually have question, answer, question, answer, question. Okay. Michael, sure, you go first.
Okay, Steve, yesterday I was interviewing Sir Martin Rees, who, of course, is a league champion of science, so we're not Rees. We talked about more progress, and he thought, yeah, I agree Pinker's data are accurate. Say, compare the Middle Ages to today. So, yes, all those curves go up or down, which measuring. But then he said, but in the Middle Ages, they could have only gone a tiny bit up, whereas we are here, but we could have gone twice as high, but we didn't, so shame on us. And I said, well, what's there at the top? He said, sweet. And I said, all right, so what's Pinker's answer to that? He goes, I can't remember. So you give us your answer.
Yes, well, I think that it's a good starter because Sweden and Frank Fukuyama had their concept of getting to Denmark as a reasonable aspiration for the world. This would answer the question, well, are you utopian? Are you hoping for some affection that it never really be built as a crook timber of humanity? And I would settle for Sweden or Denmark, even though it has been said to me by there's name now. In Switzerland, not everything is so great. You know, we're healthy, we're happy, we live a long time, we're safe, we're free. But not everyone reads priest. So life for many people is just meaningless, not worth living. So I push back against that. I think that Emerald look like people in Switzerland, that wouldn't be so bad. But of course we could do better. If life expectancy in Sweden is, let's say it's 83. Oh, I think 87 would be better. I don't think you will live forever. I don't think the singularity will happen. But I think there's always an upside. I'm not sure why Lord Priest would say that our reasonable expectation would be twice as high, unless he was simply referring to, say, Somalia being like Sweden. So in that case, why isn't Somalia like Sweden? A long list of reasons. Jared Diamond and on the Soul listed a number of the historical advantages, which maybe Europe got a head start. But all of the data that I mentioned, life expectancy, education, and so on, are, although you can break it down by continent, as I do in like now, curves are certainly separated, but all of them follow more or less parallel trajectories. That is, people in Sub-Saharan Africa live a lot longer than they do in the past. In fact, people in Sub-Saharan Africa live longer today on average than people in Europe did a century ago. So the progress is happening. It ought to happen boldly. Okay, that's a Christian gear. Okay.
I can speak loud a bit. That's easier just to speak these up.
Yeah, okay.
The last point you made about global prosperity. When you list the institution of the Enlightenment, I would add another, which is the nation state. The nation state, the fundamental invention of the liberal order. John Stuart Mill talks about it. All liberal philosophers talk about the nation, either implicitly or explicitly. Isn't one of the problems that liberals have lost the ability to talk about a inclusive civic nationalism, which both sees ground to be identitarians of the left, and the cosmopolitan liberal sort of like nation states are bad in themselves, therefore we have to let all move in vast numbers, which is causing a authoritarian backlash. Isn't it time that liberals accepted that the Enlightenment and the creation of the nation state, which leads to your political alignment, not with the tribal class or the groups you talk about, Yascha, but with the nation itself, is the only stable order that liberalism can sustain?
I'm not sure I would agree about the sport club that often pet the nation state to the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century, at least a century before it came like it. I think that it depends what you mean by nation state and how you count them down. There's no answer to that question. It's a matter of semantics, I suppose. I think there is a positive value to, and Yascha mentioned this as well, to nationalism and patriotism in the sense of collectives of people being willing to make certain sacrifices for good of everyone. I think there's a danger in nation states unless the borders are fixed and grandfathered in, which was a really innovation after 1945, not so much of the Enlightenment. That is that you don't constantly seek to draw lines around people of the same ethnicity and language, which is a formula for strife that we've led to, among other things, in the Second World War. Nations are conceivably American style as social contracts, not as embodiments of some soul, so that minorities are normal. You don't try to constantly redraw boundaries to encircle people of the same ethnicity, the formula for constant bloodshed and ethnic that finds it. So the picture is mixed. Depends on what you mean by a nation state. If it is eternal, grandfathered in borders as the default, that's by and large a good thing. I'm not sure I'm betting it to be like.
We might for once get a little bit of disagreement between Steve and I, for I think we mostly agree. I would distinguish between the question of sort of whether or not the nation state has fundamentally, historically been a force for good, and the question of whether we should embrace it in this moment as the most realistic and central mode of good soul division. And the former question is complicated because nationalism is, I think, the strongest beautiful force in certainly the 19th, 20th century. And I think it remains so today. When I was 18 in the year 2000, I think there was, especially in Europe, a kind of delusion where we'd moved beyond the nation state, but that was kind of a dead political force and a kind of historical relic. And I think everybody who operated on that political assumption has turned out to have a lot of argument fixed. So I think it now remains a fundamental political force. Now, how do you assess the impact it has had? It's been a meaningful form of political organization for many people, and it's led to forms of large-scale geographic solidarity that I think are very positive. It's also led to World War I and World War II, and I'm quite sure how to counter this against each other. So on that question, I feel very torn. Where I think it's quite easy is that once you recognize that the hope to see to move beyond nationalism is not realistic, but you're not going to be able to convince most people to do that, then you have to fill that with the appropriate meaning. And one of the problems of our parties over the last 30 years has been that many of the philosophically liberal forces have allowed people who are not liberal, in part on the left and part on the right, to fill the incredibly emotionally resonant set of symbols of a nation with what they wanted it to continue. And the best response to that is to fight on inclusive nationalism, as you say, in which we make sure that it does stand for something more noble. And I do think one of the advantages is that, nationalism reminds us we don't have to choose between different levels of identity and identification. There's nothing wrong in a liberal society with people having some strong sense of a cultural heritage, a strong attitude to religion, a strong attachment to a local place. There's nothing wrong, by the way, with some amount of global solidarity, with caring about the fate of people who are not free today in Zimbabwe, or fate of people who are living in war-torn regions as in Sudan, or fate of people who are living in great poverty in different parts of the world. But additional to that, we should defend the nation state as one of the things that allows us to expand that circular sympathy that Steve talked about, to allow us to have solidarity in these large places with very different people within them, and to fight against the evolutionary instinct to just see each other as studies. So I think, is the nation state historically possible good or ill? I think that's a complicated question. Should we abandon it? No, we should fight to fill it with an inclusive understanding that allows us to avoid a tribal society, whether at the subnational level, where our nations just degenerate into different tribes fighting each other, or at the level of one nation thinking that the only way to serve its own interests is a conflict with others. So it's through the exclusion of someone else.
Thanks very much. We got a couple questions here I'm going to go to. First in the back. Lily, bro.
Hi, Rosie Kay, choreographer and co-founder of Freedom in the Arts. One of the recent tragedies of what was sort of terming more ideology is the total capture of the arts. And the arts have greatly weaponized sympathy and empathy to bring in inefficient speed codes, enforced but fear. We just published a report, Afraid to Speak Freely, on the 6th of May. And it's an absolute, it's kind of shocking reading in terms of not just how much the arts are being silenced, but people who don't agree or dissent in any way, but how it actually limits the imagination. People are kind of censoring their ideas and their thoughts and their works, and we're missing out on maybe a generation of interesting artists and work. And along with this, our arts institutions, many set up in the Enlightenment, have failed in their mission. So how can we win them back, or should we set up a new salon de refusé?
Well, I think that question runs parallel to your question of universities. I criticized some of the taxonomy universities, but of course, universities themselves have lost the trust of a great majority of population because they were exclusionary in those kinds of ways, because a lot of people felt that they didn't fully feel welcome in those places. And I have spent many years trying to warn any university administrator who would listen to me. But in the long run, that would undermine the enterprise of the academy, not just because we're not living up to what its values is supposed to be, but because they are very significantly funded by the taxpayer. And if a majority of the population says, this is not in any way for me, I'm not welcome there, this is just serving some ideological cause that is not mine, then it was somewhat inevitable that you would eventually have politicians act on that majority opinion and say, so let's take a fight to it. And I think one of the dangers for the arts is exactly the same. I think there's some good reason. Not everybody perhaps will agree in a somewhat libertarian university, but I think there's good reason to have sub-public funding of the arts, etc. How can we keep justifying that if the only people who are able to participate in that art and the only audiences that feel represented by that art are those who believe in a very narrow slice of political opinion? So I think that this is a threat to artistic expression for all of those reasons you point out. I think it's also in a more straightforward way a threat to the future of funding for the arts, because at some point, majorities of voting people are going to say, why spend money on that? And as somebody who comes from a family of artists, my mother's a musician, and who once upon a time had ambitions of being a theater director, I do think the arts are important. It would be a great tragedy if they lose so much public support and relevance that they just get the arts.
I think it's a valid observation. If we're interested in critical woke studies, what happened to the university? How do we understand the takeover of wokeness? How do we change it? We should narrowly focus on the university simply because parallel phenomena have happened in our artistic or institutions, museums, symphonies, torn apart by, in some ways, worse than what's happened in academia. Publishing houses, nonprofits that were set up to advance freedom of speech and humanism, such as the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Humanist Association, and they're taken over by wokeness. So we try to figure out what went on. We actually think, what is it about these institutions that make them vulnerable or attracted to takeover by illiberal leftism? One reason may be just pure selection, that if you're more on the right, you might think that the best way of improving humanity is to start business or provide products at a lower price. Whereas if you're on the left, it's by changing institutions and symbol manipulation and including the arts and knowledge. And in fact, there is, I think, an intellectualized version of it. I think the Marcuse is that it's sometimes called the long march through institutions, but the way to change society is to kind of leisurely take over the non-profits, universities, cultural and artistic institutions, and they've followed that playbook.